Hello friends, very good morning to all of you. So yeah, we have completed the PF16 all parts. Like part 1 we just discussed about adapter, and we just created also few adapters in the lab, and then we covered the authentication policy contract in the PF16 part 2, right? And the PF16 part 3 we talk about the radius and the Kerberos authentication, right? So it's completed like 3 parts. And yeah, now we are jumping to the authentication selector configuration. So in this video, let's quickly discuss the different types of selector, what is selector, different types of selector, and we'll just try to build a few of the selectors in our lab environment. Yeah, so let's begin. So what is authentication selector, right? So it basically used for handling complex hierarchical access policy decisions, right? That means, for an example, if I need to make some decision, right? Like you can imagine of if else condition, right? Like how in the if else condition we are doing, right? Like if this condition is true, then just put this action, right? If this condition is false, then put this action, right? So in that case, like we are just taking a decision, right, on the basis of some result, right? So similar way, authentication selector is just helping you to making some decisions, right? And on that basis, on that decision only, you can just build the you can just send the user to some authentication source, right? So that user can get authenticated from that source basically, or that particular mechanism, right? So for an example, what I'm trying to say here, like authentication selector is just, if authentication selector is just helping you to make a decision, right? Like for an example, like if user is accessing some application from internet, right? Like from internet medium, right? Not intranet, like it's not from company network, but from internet, right? So in that case, authentication selector is basically helping you to make a decision, right? Okay, that this user is trying to access a SSO based application from internet, right? So if authentication selector is telling you to this, then what you can do, you have a policy which can just trigger two authentication sources to the user, right? Two authentication sources means like you can just give HTML form adapter to the user. That means user can just enter the ID and password and get their authentication complete, right? That is one thing. And next, after that, you can just go for the multi-factor authentication also, right? The second factor through ping ID or maybe any other product, right? But user has to go like that. So that basically using authentication selector, you are able to decide, right? Okay, this user is coming from internet, so I need to give these two authentication sources to the user, right? First factor as well as second factor. But if user is coming from my company network, that is already a trusted, that user is a trusted user, right? So in that case, I'll just give a form based authentication. That means I'll just send user to HTML form adapter. That means it can just give a username password paste to the user. User will enter the username and password and get their authentication complete, right? That's the way. So basically selector is just helping you to make a decision, right? So now let's try to understand what different types of selector PingFederate is providing you, and we can just try to build like few of them in our lab environment also. In industry also, people are not using all the different types, but we at least again we need to know, right, in similar way how we just understand the adapter, right? Different types of adapter. So we need to just understand different types of selector also, and maybe as per the requirement from the team, you can build that, right? So let's try to understand first in our list is CIDR, okay? It will not take much time to understand this selector part, right? Because it is just helping you to build a decision, right? Because we already understand adapter. That means we already understand the authentication mechanism, right? How the authentication is going to happen, because it is only handled by adapter, right? In selector, we are just trying to understand the decision making thing, right? How PingFed can take a decision. So that way selector is helping PingFederate to take a decision, right? And then send the user to some authentication sources, right? Like form, HTML form, certificate based authentication, Kerberos, multi-factor, like that, yeah? So CIDR authentication selector we have first in our list. What is CIDR authentication selector? So we basically talked the first, right, about the if user is trying to access from internet or from the company network, then how the things will happen, right? So this is a type of CIDR authentication selector which basically helps PingFederate to identify whether the user is accessing an application from internet or intranet, right? Means whether it's user is trying to access an application from outside company network or from inside company network, right? So how it basically works, it's basically you just need to define like a subnet in that. Under once we just go to the CIDR authentication selector, we just need to add the subnet range, right? So that using that subnet range only, PingFederate can able to decide, right, if the user is trying to access an application and coming from that subnet region, right, that network region, that means user is from intranet, right, from company network. But if user is not coming from that region, that means user is from internet, right? So those subnet basically is helping you, those network or subnet region is basically helping PingFederate to understand, right? So it just, you can say, provide a means of choosing authentication sources at runtime based on whether an end user's IP address falls within specified ranges using CIDR, right? That is classless inter-domain range routing notation, right? So basically under this you just need to define that subnet range, right? And from that only PingFed able to decide by using user's IP address that whether that user IP is coming in that range or not. If that is present in that range, that means you are in company network. If you are not, that means you are in internet, right? So based on that, PingFederate can easily able to take a decision, right? Like if user is like from this network, I need to give this type of authentication to the user, right? If user is from this network, then I can give the decision, give the authentication like that. Like for an example, if I can, what I'm saying, this is a decision making thing, right? You can say this is internet, okay, and this is intranet, okay, company network. So user is basically trying to access, right, some application, right? Now this user first, when user request will reach to the PingFederate, right? So using this selector, like as in the selector we have the subnet range configured, right? So through that we can able to identify the user IP address is under that range or not. If that under range, that means user is in the company network. If not, then user in the internet, right? So if user in the internet, then what I will do, I'll just give two authentication to the user, right? First I'll give first factor, that is I'll give maybe HTML form, right, where user can enter the ID and password, and then I'll give the second factor, right? Second factor means multi-factor authentication. That means I can just give OTP kind of thing or like that, okay, using ping ID or any product, right? But if user is from intranet, that means user is a trusted user, right? It's already in our company network, right? So in that case, I'll just give only one authentication, right? First factor only. In some cases, if there are many critical application in organization, right? So in that case, what will happen, no? Like if you are trying to access from internet or intranet, it doesn't matter, right? You will get both factor authentication, first factor as well as second factor, because that's a critical application, right? So based on that it works. So this is about CIDR, right? Now let's quickly, let me erase this. Okay, yeah, so the next type is in my list is cluster node AS, okay, cluster node AS, that is cluster node authentication selector. So what is happening here, basically I have also not configured this in my environment in my last project or maybe previous project, right? But what does it basically does this cluster node AS, it basically provide a means of picking authentication sources, because in everywhere you're trying to pick the authentication sources only, right? Because your main goal is to authenticate the user, but to pick that you need to just add some condition, right? You need to do some checks, right? So where selector is playing a role, right? So we understand CIDR how it works, right? So same like cluster node AS is cluster node authentication selector, how it works. So it provide a means of picking authentication sources or other authentication sources at runtime based on the PingFederate cluster node that is servicing the request, or that is serving the request basically, right? So basically you are deciding authentication sources. That means authentication sources means like certificate based authentication, form based authentication, multi-factor, whatever, right? Just it's saying about authentication type, right? So what we understand in the adapter section, right? So it basically it's just going to help you to pick the authentication sources based on PingFederate cluster node that is serving the request. So you have a cluster node, right? In our lab environment you see, right, we have one cluster node that is running on the Linux machine, right? RHEL machine, Red Hat Enterprise Linux machine, right? So in a similar way, in the company you can see you have multiple nodes running in the cluster, not one, maybe you have 10 engine nodes running on the cluster, right? So out of 10, maybe if you want to make some node as a, if you want make some node that if that node receive a request, then this authentication can trigger. So you can go for like this cluster node AS, right? So it basically is helping to choose authentication sources based on the PingFed cluster node, okay, that is serving the request in the runtime. Whatever the request is getting received by which node, on that basis you can design an authentication sources, right? So if the request received by the cluster node 1, then go for certificate based authentication. If the request received by the cluster node 2, then go for form based authentication, like that, okay? So it's just help in the cluster node, okay? So you have, if you have the PingFed running on the cluster, you can just design this, but yeah, it's not required. I don't see any requirement for this node, this cluster node AS, right, in the company. That's why I haven't seen it's been used also in any of the company, right? Third one is connection set. Yeah, this is important, but again there is some there is some like lag in this. Like maybe we can understand later, not now. I'll just talk you that what is the problem here. Sorry. Yeah, so connection set authentication selector, what is this basically? Here basically like it's basically work in the basis of match, like. So connection set authentication selector basically you can use for WS-Fed connection, you can use for SAML connection, not for the OAuth, okay? For OAuth we have a different, like I'll just quickly discuss after that on that also, right? So this is mainly for the SAML and WS-Fed connection, and this works on the basis of match, right? That means you have a SAML application, take an example, you have a SAML application configured in PingFederate, and that SAML application have an identifier, right? That means an entity ID, application have an entity ID, which we are saying as an identifier of the application. So that identifier you just need to simply add to this connection set authentication selector. That means you will simply create this selector and just add that identifier of the application that is configured in the PingFederate, that SAML application, right? Simply you will just configure in this selector, right, in the connection set authentication selector. Now what will happen, how this will work, right? So if request received by the PingFederate, right, then you define this selector in some policy, right, where you are just building the logic. So in that policy you will just whatever the policy, just look for this selector. It will look for, okay, what application is mapped, right? So if there is that application, what request came, if it is matches, then whatever the what logic you build, it will just trigger, right? That means like what I'm trying to say that means a user, okay, user is trying to access ServiceNow application, right? ServiceNow. So ServiceNow, you can say it act as an identifier, okay? Now it send a request to PingFederate. In PingFederate we have policy 1, okay, P1. In P1 we are basically looking for, we are just configured with this selector only, connection set AS, okay? So we basically just, I will put CAS, okay, connection set authentication selector we built. Under this selector we have mapped the ServiceNow identifier, okay? That means ServiceNow is already configured in PingFederate. We simply map this identifier under this selector. So once there is a match happened here, then whatever, then you can just build a logic here, right? So this is a condition check, right? As I'm saying, selector is means for condition check, right? So when this condition meet, right, when this match happened, then simply it will just, you have some authentication sources designed here, right? And based on that you can just give an experience to the user. Authentication sources means like any certificate based authentication, or like form based or whatever, right, what we discussed in adapter, right? So you can just give that experience to the user, right? So basically it's just doing a match case, right? So when a request came, in the request you have an application ID. So if it matches with the application configured in PingFederate, and you map that connection in this CAS, connection set authentication selector, then this policy will trigger, right? And whatever the sources, authentication sources you defined here, it will happen, right? User will get that type of authentication. So here simply you need to build this selector. You can simply map that connection that is configured in PingFederate to this selector. Now once this request is going to come to PingFederate, it will simply do a match here. If that matches, if the application ID in the request matches with the application ID mapped in this selector, then simply that policy will trigger and user will get that authentication mechanism, right? Certificate based or like maybe form based, right? So I'll say here X509, that is certificate based authentication, or form based authentication, right? So it depends on the maybe whatever the sources you defined here, right? But first there is a match, right, to the application ID coming in the request and mapped in the connection set authentication selector configured in PingFederate, right? So you simply need to create this and just map that connection in this, right? And then as per the match happened, from the request, it can just occur, right? That policy will trigger. So it just work on the match basis, right? In the request what ID is coming, and in the selector CAS what connection you mapped, right? Based on the match, it will just trigger. Okay, so just understand selector is just meant for condition check, right? So you can just check the condition on different bases, right? Like on the network part, on this matching of ID, application ID part, and there are varieties of things, right? But the main goal is to make some decision, yeah, and then we can define some policy, right? We can, because we need to trigger an authentication, but we can't trigger the default the common one to every request, right? We need to understand also what type of request is coming from the user, right, as a best practice. Okay, so now let's quickly jump to fourth point. Okay, so fourth one is like in our list is extended property AS. Okay, this is also one of the type of authentication selector. So what happens here in extended property, right? So again here also it basically works for like SAML, WSFed or OAuth client. For all different types of application it will work. And what is happening here, again it's doing a condition check, right? And how it check the condition, that means you will simply create a extended property selector, right, AS, and you will define the attributes here, right? That means you can just define here different attributes under this selector. That means you can define like attribute A, I'm just giving an example, right? Attribute B, attribute C, attribute D, right? Like that. So you build a selector, extended property, and you define these values, right? And what this value represent, it represent going to be just trigger and authentication sources, right? That we can understand in the policy, right? That means like you simply first in the PingFed I am saying that you simply create this selector, you created the attribute values. Now while building the policy, like I'll say policy 2, while building the policy 2, what you will do, you will just look for first the selector, that is extended, I'll say EAS. You will first look for the extended property authentication selector. Once this selector come into the picture, then you have defined authentication sources for different attribute values. Like for A, certificate based authentication, for B, form based authentication, that is happening through HTML form adapter, C, multi-factor authentication using ping ID, okay, MFA you say MFA, D, Kerberos authentication, right? For example I'm saying. So basically you just created this extended property authentication selector and you define the attribute, and all those attributes represent an authentication sources in the policy, right? Now how this policy is going to trigger? So simply like in the application, while you are building the application in PingFed, whether it's OAuth or SAML or WSFed, Web Server Federation, you can see there is an option of extended property. So under that property of application, you need to define the attribute values, right? So if I just onboard an application, a SAML application, right, SAML app, so under that, under application, I'll get an option of extended property, right? In that I need to define the attribute value, either A, B, C, D, right? A risk level value basically it represent. So if I define simple A value, right, then for example if an application, okay, that if that SAML application, if the user is trying to access that SAML application, right, then what happened, it basically sends a request to PingFederate. Now in the PingFederate, this policy 2 will look, okay, that this application is mapped with the risk value or the extended property value as value A, right? So what value A does, it's basically go for certificate based authentication. So just give a certificate based authentication to the user, right? So first simply what happened, it just like it will look for you just need to map the policies, right? So first the request will come and it will look, okay, this application is mapped to this EAS selector, and EAS selector is defined in the policy 2. Now what policy 2 is saying, it simply says that if the application mapped with this value, then what authentication sources is going to happen, right? So first it will look for the selector, okay, this application is mapped to EAS. Now EAS mapped to which policy? So the policy is P2. Under P2, what A represent? Okay, so it represents certificate based authentication. So just give a user a certificate based authentication experience, right? And yeah, like if that fails, then you need to define the failure cases also, right? If certificate based authentication not work, then you can go for the form based authentication, like that. So you need to define the fail cases also, right? so that the user will not face any issue, right? If that certificate based authentication not work due to some reason, right, like that. So it depends on selector only, you are taking decision and then building the policy, right? So in this case also, using the risk level value ABCD, you are defining an authentication. First you are just configuring the selector, adding the attribute values and defining that attribute values in the application. Using that you are just triggering the authentication. So connection set and extend property is somehow similar, but using connection set you are simply defining the application, right? And then you just need to open the application, you just need to open the selector, then you need to add the application there, right? Whereas in the extend property you are simply just going to the application, simply adding that value. You are not touching the selector, right? You are simply opening the application, updating the single value, whatever ABCD something, just save the connection, that's all. Simply that policy will trigger, because that policy will look, okay, this application is mapped to the EAS selector and EAS is mapped to P2 policy 2, and if the application is mapped with the value A, then what authentication sources is going to trigger is basically defined under policy 2, right? So like that. So that's why, like, I'll just talk you in the later session, right? Like how the connection, what is the problem in the connection set authentication selector, right? And how you can just give weightage to extended property AS, right? And how extended property is making your life easier. We can talk on that also, right, later in the topic. So let's remove this also, yeah. Yeah, sorry, it's just taking a little more time, like, to erase this, but yeah, let me remove this quickly. Okay, so now in my list is fifth number, okay? So fifth number is HTTP header AS, okay? So it basically again like, yeah, in all the selectors basically work on decision making only, right? Again here also it's a kind of decision, right? So in the header, once we configure this header AS, we just need to give the value, right? Expression value that maybe with a star, like star like value ABC, like that, right? So basically we just need to map, once we define this HTTP header AS, we just need to define this under expression, this value, right? So that in the header, if once the request is reaching to PingFederate, if in that request in the HTTP header, if this value matches, then simply whatever the policy, in the policy whatever that you configure the authentication sources, again same thing will happen. So in all the selector you can see things are common, that if I can just quickly show you something. So first of all, like, you have a selector, and then you have the authentication sources, like that means X509, certificate based authentication, form based authentication, multi-factor authentication, Kerberos authentication, right? So all these authentication you have in the authentication sources. So basically first selector is coming, and then you have the policy. So basically what is happening here, in selector you are taking decision. With the help of this selector you are taking some decision, right? Like in the HTTP header you say whether extend property, whether CIDR, whether connection set. In all the selector you are basically taking a decision, and on that basis you are sending a user to some authentication sources, right? Either X509 or form or MFA or yeah, like Kerberos, right? Any one of these based on decision. So in all the selector you are basically taking a decision, and on basis of that decision you are just sending a user to some authentication sources, right? And yeah, like basically you just need to define that application under that selector, right? So that the policy can trigger for that application, right? So that we understand more while we build the policy, but for now just try to understand different type of selector, and we can just quickly build also few of them in the lab. Okay, let's try to understand six in our sixth list is, again, what is this? HTTP, sorry, request parameter AS. Okay, so HTTP request parameter authentication selector. So what is this? It just basically provide a means of selecting authentication sources or other authentication sources at runtime based on the query parameter values in the HTTP request. So it's again same thing. So in the request, whatever you have the query parameter, based on that again there will be match in PingFederate for taking decision, and on by the taking a decision, again it will just go for some authentication sources, right? Whether it's certificate or form or like that. Yeah. So kind of same thing. 7 we have OAuth client set AS. Yeah, so what is OAuth client set authentication selector? It's just like the same what we discussed for the connection set authentication selector, that is the number 3, right? So connection set authentication selector is basically like for the SAML and WSFed applications, and this OAuth client set is mainly for the OAuth and OpenID Connect applications, right? So here again it's just the same thing. You're just simply mapping that client ID in that selector, and again there is a match. Like for example, once an user initiated the OAuth request, like basically user will try to access some OAuth application, and that OAuth application will initiate a OAuth request to PingFederate, right? In that in the request there will be a client ID, again that is going to be match in the PingFederate. If there is a match in that selector, in the client set selector, then whatever the authentication sources you design, it will trigger, right? So first is decision, and decision is just happening on the basis of match. Again in the request some client ID is coming, if that is matching under that selector, then that policy will trigger, and in that policy whatever the authentication sources designed, it can occur, right? So just try to understand every all the different types of selectors, same thing is happening, right? You're taking a decision and then you're triggering an authentication sources. While taking a decision, in that decision only you are just trying to map that application, and then you are just doing some checks, right? And on the basis of checks you understand, okay, this connection is matched here in this selector, and this selector is configured under this policy number, right? Policy 2, 3, whatever, right? And in the policy 2, whatever the authentication sources you define, it will occur for the user, right? Like that. Okay, number 8 we have OAuth scope AS. So scope AS, like scope OAuth scope authentication selector, right? So what is this basically? Okay, it's not coming. Yeah, so what is this OAuth scope AS? So again the same thing, right? So again there is a match thing here also, right? So for example, you just build the selector, right? OAuth scope AS in the PingFederate, and you define some scope under that selector, right? And based on that you just you're triggering some authentication sources, right? Now when there is a request, right, when there is a OAuth request is initiated from the application to PingFederate, in that request they will send some scope value, right? Taken a scope value as a, right? And if that value basically matches with this scope based authentication selector that you defined in PingFederate, then that policy will trigger, right? And again that policy, whatever the authentication sources you have, it will occur, right? So based on the scope value you are designing an authentication, right? So for an example, if I'm just passing a value a, right, in the scope, like I'm just a developer of OAuth application, okay, and I'm basically sending a parameter of a in the scope. You will understand what is scope later, right, in the OAuth section, but for now just try to understand. You have one selector OAuth scope, it just work on the basis of match only. That means I have OAuth application, and that is basically sending a request to PingFederate some authorization endpoint, right? In that application is passing a scope parameter, right, as a scope parameter as a, right? Now in the PingFederate, that same scope value is mapped, okay, to that selector. Now if there is a match here, that scope A matches with the selector configured in PingFederate with that scope, right, then what happened, you have defined some authentication sources again for that, right? That whether it go for certificate based authentication or like that, right? So based on the scope value you are defining an authentication, right? So that's something you can achieve using OAuth scope based authentication selector, right? You can design an authentication on the basis of scope value, right? So an application can pass some value in the scope, and you define the value, same value in the PingFederate, and if there is a match happened, then you are just giving some authentication sources to the user, right? Or whether certificate and Kerberos or like that. Yeah. Now in our list is 2 are left, I think. Yeah. So 9 is like requested authentication contact is, okay. I think you are maybe aware of this. Requested authentication context. Okay, so requested context authentication, requested authentication context is, right, authentication selector. So how it basically works. So again, it basically provides a means of picking authentication sources at runtime based on the authentication context requested by NSP, right? That means you have an application, right? So that application basically, while sending the request to PingFederate, like take an example of SAML application, right? So in the SAML application, if that application basically sending a parameter or you can say the authentication context, right, in that request itself and sending to PingFederate, and if that it matches to this selector, then again that policy will trigger, right? And in that policy, whatever the authentication sources you defined, it user will experience that authentication. So again, everywhere it's a condition of match only in most of the cases, right? So again, how it runs, it basically just like it just means picking authentication sources at runtime based on the authentication context requested by an SP, right? That means an application will just simply pass some authentication context in the request, and that will simply do a match here, right? In the PingFederate, in the selector, whatever you did, right? If there is a match happened, then it will simply just trigger the authentication sources as defined in the policy, right? So basically, application will simply just do the request of this in the authentication context, right? And based on that, you will triggering the authentication, right? So you are going to define that under the selector, and then you can just define under policy, right? So application will simply just pass something like form-based authentication, right? So PingFederate can give them the form-based authentication like that, yeah. So it's based on the request, based on the authentication context, like SP can just just force the PingFederate to, or not force, I'll just simply just say PingFederate to, hey, give me the form-based authentication, if you just configure the selector like that, okay? So you're just passing that parameter in the request, and based on that, PingFederate is giving you that form-based authentication, and you define this in the policy based on the selector, right? So it's a game of selector, policies, and adapter. You can see, so you're getting something right now, right? So session AS. So session AS is our last in the list. So session authentication selector is basically enabling PingFederate to choose a policy path at runtime, okay, on whether the user already has a PingFed authentication session for a particular source, right? So it basically works if a user have like some session as PingFed, like a valid, if user have a valid or already having a PingFederate authentication session for a particular source. In that case, this selector will come into the picture, and under that and whatever the policy you defined here, that authentication sources will trigger, right? So again, it's like checking the session of the user, right? PingFederate authentication session. If the session exists already, then you can just define the policy, and you can basically define the authentication sources for this selector under policy, right? Okay, like that. So based on work on the if user have the PingFederate session, right? On that basis, you are just defining an authentication sources, right? So what is exactly happening in all this, if I can say, this is the end of selector. We can just quickly do some lab work quickly. But this is important, right? If I can go directly to the lab, you will not understand this part, right? So that's why I'm just discussing few things here, and then I'm jumping to the lab work, right? Basically, we discussed, I think, here like policy, selector, adapter, right? So you understand here, right, how there is a relation, right? So you understand a little bit on policy part for now also, right? But definitely once we just discuss on the next session, you will understand more, right? But you can see, right, how this policy, where you are just building the logic, right? Then you have the selector, which basically help you to taking a decision, right? And you have the adapter, right, which basically that help you to give an authentication mechanism to the user, right? That is where the certificate based authentication, form based authentication, or multi-factor authentication like that, or Kerberos based, right? And under adapter we have the PCV, right? And PCV is connect to data store, right, where exactly the you are making a connection with the directory server, right? So but all the adapters not required PCV, right? Like certificate based authentication, Kerberos, these are not required any PCV, right? Because the mechanism of that is a different, what we understand in the adapter section, right? Certificate based authentication works in a different way. Kerberos based authentication works with the AD, right? So you just need to configure the Active Directory. Not PCV is not required for that, right? But we have many other adapters where the PCV is required. So just for understanding, you can see all these things are linked, right? So that's why we understand first data store, where we connect to OpenDJ directory server, right? Then we build a PCV, right, who basically help in verifying the user credential. Then we build the adapter, right, where we are just giving a user experience, authentication experience to the user, right, where we are designing an authentication experience, whether certificate based, Kerberos, form based, multi-factor, or any other authentication experience, right? And then we have the selector, where we're building the logics, not building a logic, I'll say the condition, where we are checking the conditions, right, in selectors, and based on that condition, the policy is triggering, right? So basically, like if that application is mapped to some selector, right? So in that decision, that basically it will come, right? It will just do the match, and whatever the that authentication sources we define under policy, that will trigger, right? So policy work on this like this only, right? You need to define selector, adapter in that only, and on the basis of condition check, right? Because selector helps you to check the condition, right? and if that condition check for some selector, right, like selector number 2, okay, selector number 2 where we have the application mapped, and while user trying to access the application, right, and if that application is mapped to selector 2, right, then PingFederate will look, okay, this selector 2 is mapped to which policy, right? So PingFed can see it's mapped to policy number 3, right? So what policy number 3 says that, okay, if this condition fine, then just give a user to form based authentication, right? So that experience will happen. So first the selector, right, and once that selector is gets matched, then the policy will come into the picture, right? And then with the basis of policy, the authentication sources will going to trigger, right? So this is the way it basically works, right? So you have all those three things in the link, right? Policy, selector, adapters, right? So yeah, and the PCB data store is basically already inbuilt in that adapter. We are just building while we are building the adapter, right? So that's the whole concept, right? So yeah, once we just in the next session we're just going to cover the policy, so you'll get a very good idea again that that how these things work together, right? And yeah, but for now I think you have some good understanding of policy also, right? How selector is helping in decision making, and how the policy is triggering, and how user is basically getting an authentication, right? So let's quickly jump to the lab environment and let's quickly build some few selectors, okay? And then we can quickly jump to fragment configuration in the PF18, right? And then on PF19 we'll talk about the policy building, okay? Log into the admin node quickly. And then we can quickly create a few of the selectors, okay? So let me go to authentication tab, then go to policies, and then go to selectors, okay? Okay, so let's go for create new instance. So we'll just choose as a type first as a CIDR, okay? Maybe we are not able to, I'm not going to do testing here for CIDR, but let's create that, okay? So just give you some idea, like let's mention as a selector 1 CIDR, okay? That we discussed basically to distinguish the user network, right? Yeah. So we just need to define the subnet in that, and on that basis we can define from the user IP address if the user is like from which network, right? And based on that we can define an authentication sources, right? So let's go next. Okay, so here you have the network range CIDR notation, right? So here we just need to give that value, right? That subnet range value. So you just need to give here you need to give here and then click on update, and you can add multiple here, right? So for an example, if I can give something here like 0.0.0.0/0, okay, and let me update it. Yeah, it's added, right? So in similar way we can add multiple here, right? Like different subnet range, right? And then we can decide that PingFed can decide, okay, if user is like coming from which network, right? So I just given here just to show you how you can create, okay, but I'm not going to test this. So let me save this. It is fine, not a problem. Let's create another selector, that is selector 2, and let's mention this as a choose a type as a connection set authentication selector, okay? So I'll put selector 2 CSAS, okay? So connection set we already discussed, right? So it basically, sorry, what happened here? It basically like you can use this for the match case, right? So if there is a SAML application, and in that request if that in the request there is an ID of application is coming, right? Application identifier basically they are sending. So PingFederate will just do a match, and if there is a match happened in this selector, then basically the authentication will trigger, right? Based on the policy you defined, right? Under the policy you defined, right? So it's a match concept of the ID, application ID from the request and the PingFederate under the selector, okay? So let's go for next. So it will ask you to add an application, right? So I basically created a dummy app, okay? Maybe we have few sessions where I'll just show you how to create a SAML connection, okay, in PingFederate. But for now just understand that we have some dummy app and I added that. Let me update this. That means like dummy app is the application name, or the ID you can say. The ID is basically dummy app. So if this is matched while the user is trying to access some application, maybe the dummy app application, then this selector will come into the picture, and the policy you defined for this selector, and under that whatever the authentication sources you have configured, that will trigger for the user, right? whether certificate based authentication Kerberos, like that. Let me go to next and save this also. Okay, let me try to create some other also, like selector 3. I'll just choose as a type here as a extended property selector. Okay, so I'll say EPS. If you remember that, sorry, I make a spelling wrong. Selector 3 EPS. Okay, that is fine. So extended property is basically like you are defining the attribute here, and based on that you are defining under application whether SAML or OAuth, and then you define the policy, like basically when the user accesses the application, PingFed basically look for that, okay, application have this value, you have updated some value under extended property, so you look for that value and just check that selector, okay, which selector is this, and then yeah, it will go for the policy, right, under in the under policy whatever the authentication sources you define, right. So let me go to next, I'll show you. So extended property we can just create here also, right. For an example, I'll just go to manage extended properties. Okay, maybe I'll remove this, I delete. You can delete the extended property, name something, okay, like I'll say app authentication, sorry, level, something like that. Okay, and let me click on add. So app authentication level is our extended property. Okay, under that let's select that first. Okay, case sensitive matching is there. Now go to next. Now this is the result value. Result value means, if you remember in the session I discussed about the under extended property that you have the attribute defined as A, B, C, D, right, and A represent certificate based authentication, B represent like that. So right, so basically that you define under policy. So if this selector have this value A, then what authentication will come? If the value have B, then what authentication will come, right? So in the similar way, what we'll do, I'll just give the result value here, right? So result value I'll just put first as a, like we have HTML form with OpenDJ. Okay, basically you remember I'm just putting the name because we can just relate with the authentication sources. So we have basically, we just created 3 adapter, right? One with the HTML form OpenDJ, one with the HTML form simple username PCV, and another with composite adapter, right? So for all these 3 authentication sources, I'll just give a result value. Okay, just click on add. I'll mention HTML form SUPCV. Okay, and then let's mention another one as a composite. Just mention composite only. Okay, so you have 3 adapter, and adapter basically represents an authentication sources, right? That's why you build 3 values here, so that yeah, once we define this value under application, right, it can simply just trigger that policy which basically applies this selector, and whatever the authentication sources you define, like for composite it should be composite HTML form OpenDJ, for HTML form OpenDJ adapter, right, and SUPCV for that adapter only, right. So let's go next. This is basically completed only. Let's try to save this. This is done. Okay, let's see if we can create some more also, like HTTP header, leave this HTTP request. This is, I think, just like, yeah, it's again match condition. Okay, auth client set also we can do, but yeah, we just need to have it just work like connection set authentication selector, right? It just work in the similar fashion, the matching of the application ID, but this is mainly for the auth application, right? So we haven't like created any dummy auth application for now, because we just need to do some implementation for auth, right? Then we can start. So yeah, maybe it will take some time. We need to cover a few sessions, then we can jump to auth. So leave this. Let's create auth scope. Okay, one more. So you say as a selector 4, and we have OSAS. Okay, auth scope authentication selector. So you remember auth scope is like basically, okay, again I think we can't create this also, because yeah, like it should be the matching scope matching case, right? Like you need to first create a scope in PingFederate also, right, so that you can match with the incoming request from the auth application. So yeah, like we can't able to create this also. Like if I can show you, if I can go for next, it will just ask me to add a new row to scope, right? And I haven't defined any scope in my PingFed yet, right? That's why it is no result available. And if I am not going to define here, the selector is not going to be created, right? Because that required a scope value. Okay, so leave this, maybe it's not allowed for now. So it's done. Let's do the cluster management. Like replicate means that pushing the changes to our engine node, that is 10.128.0.4. okay, it's replicated. Okay, let me verify it. Okay, yeah, it's fine. Let's go and check our selector, it's created or not. Go to policy, check selector. Okay, yeah, we have 3. You can check adapter also from here. IDP adapter we created 3, right? Composite, HTML form and all. Okay, so this looks fine. Let's quickly jump to the fragment session. Yeah, it is again a short session. We can just discuss what is fragment, and we can quickly create a fragment in PingFederate. And yeah, and then we can jump to the policy section. Okay, so yeah, thank you for watching the video.